The moment Rowan Hale stepped down from the disabled jet, Evelyn Blackwood let her cane fall from her hand. She stared at the mechanic in the oil-stained jacket as though a dead man had just walked across the tarmac toward her. Chief Executive Sloan Blackwood froze beside her mother, watching the color drain from the older woman's face. Inside the cabin, a hidden navigation module had just sent one last corrupted signal, the exact pattern that had destroyed a program the family swore had ended forever. Rowan tried to turn away, but it was already too late. Evelyn's whisper carried across the hangar like a verdict no one expected to hear again, and Sloan understood that the failure which had grounded her flight was never an accident at all. If you love aviation mysteries with a twist you won't see coming, subscribe now and stay with me, because the man everyone had buried 12 years ago was about to walk straight back into the fire he'd been hiding from. The private jet carrying Sloan and her mother toward the meeting that would decide the future of the Vesper X program began reporting impossible position errors somewhere above the planes. The pilot diverted to Greyhaven Regional, a small airfield outside Blackwood Aeronautics' maintenance network, because the nearest certified facility was too far to reach safely. Rowan Hale was the only technician on duty licensed for advanced avionics work, and he approached the aircraft with the same quiet focus he brought to every job, unimpressed by the woman stepping off the jet in a tailored coat. Within minutes, he traced the fault to something buried beneath the primary flight computer, a secondary signal feeding false data into the navigation system on a cycle, so precise it could not have been accidental. He pulled back a panel and found a small bridging device disguised as a routine diagnostic connector, its casing scored where someone had scraped away a marking. Under the scratches, the faint outline of a 7-point constellation remained, and Rowan's hands went still the instant he recognized it. He covered the device before anyone else could see it, told the ground crew it was a simple sensor fault, and asked the passengers to wait outside while he finished the paperwork. He wanted the aircraft gone, the woman gone, and the whole afternoon forgotten before his daughter's babysitter expected him home. That plan ended the moment Evelyn walked into the hangar and saw his face beneath the fluorescent lights. She dropped her cane, pressed a hand to her chest, and said a single word no one at Greyhaven had ever spoken about him. Orion. You've got the wrong man, Rowan told her, his voice even despite the sudden tightness in his jaw. Evelyn answered with a line only a handful of people alive still remembered, a phrase once used to steady frightened pilots inside a program that no longer officially existed. Rowan did not move, and in his silence, Sloan understood that the woman trembling beside her had not imagined a stranger's resemblance. She had recognized a man everyone believed had died 12 years earlier. The security detail traveling with Sloan moved instinctively toward Rowan, unsure whether to treat Evelyn's outburst as the confusion of an older woman or a genuine threat to the aircraft they had just escaped. Sloan raised a hand to hold them back, more curious than alarmed, studying the mechanic's face for the recognition her mother so plainly felt. He looked like no one from the corporate world she usually moved through. No polished credentials, no tailored suit, only calloused hands and the quiet posture of a man who preferred machinery to people. Evelyn took an unsteady step forward, refusing the aide beside her, and asked Rowan whether he remembered a hangar in Nevada and a night when the desert wind nearly tore the doors off their hinges before a single test flight. His jaw tightened further, but he said nothing, and the silence told her everything the years apart had failed to erase. Sloan ordered the hangar doors closed and asked Rowan to explain himself, her tone carrying the same authority that ran boardrooms twice the size of the small building around them. He refused, insisting he was nothing more than a civilian engineer who needed to get home before his neighbor put his daughter to bed. A short phone call followed. Rowan's voice softened completely as he asked 9-year-old Maisie about her homework and promised to check on her model airplane before mourning a scene so ordinary it made Evelyn's accusation feel almost impossible. Then Evelyn explained quietly that the man once known by that code name had been the finest systems specialist in a classified initiative called Asterion, a program built to test experimental flight control architecture years ahead of anything commercial. 12 years earlier, he had been aboard an advanced prototype called the Aquila 12 when it vanished from radar during a routine evaluation flight. Investigators found burned wreckage in a dry lake bed in Nevada, but no remains could ever be identified, and the government eventually declared the entire test team deceased. Rowan still refused to confirm anything about his past, but he warned Sloan that the device hidden in her jet was not something an amateur could build in a garage. It could feed false position data, trigger phantom engine alarms, and slowly convince a flight crew that every instrument on the panel had turned against them. The goal is rarely to crash the plane, he explained. It's to push a pilot into making one catastrophic decision while they believe the decision is necessary. Sloan wanted the device taken straight to Blackwood's own laboratories for analysis. Rowan objected at once, arguing that any evidence carried into corporate headquarters could disappear before anyone outside the company ever examined it. Before they could settle it, Chief Test Pilot Naomi Vance called with news that made the argument moot within seconds. Engineers had just found an identical timing signature buried inside the new Vesper X prototype, the one scheduled for its investor unveiling. Rowan realized the saboteur had not resurfaced by coincidence. Someone out there already knew Orion was alive, and that someone wanted him back in the cockpit. Sloan spent the better part of an hour convincing Rowan to come to Blackwood's testing center, promising his identity would stay protected, and that a discreet detail would watch over Maisie without the girl ever noticing. He agreed only after setting 3 conditions she accepted without hesitation. No one would touch the recovered device without his presence. Every byte of data would be copied onto an independent server outside company control, and if the trail ever pointed at someone inside Blackwood itself, he would be free to report it directly to federal investigators. At an archive building Sloan rarely visited, Evelyn unsealed a storage room that had stayed locked for over a decade, its shelves lined with folders marked Aquila 12 and a small collection of photographs from the Asterian team. Sloan studied one image longer than the rest, a younger Rowan standing beside the prototype, his printed name blacked out beneath a strip of tape that had long since yellowed. Whatever doubt remained in her mind disappeared the instant she matched his eyes in the photograph to the man standing quietly beside her. Rowan finally offered a fragment of the truth he had guarded for so long. The Aquila 12 had not fallen from the sky the way the reports claimed, because he had shut down the failing central computer himself and guided the aircraft onto the lake bed using nothing but manual backup controls. After the crew evacuated safely, a fire consumed most of the wreckage before anyone could preserve the flight recorder. A counterintelligence unit quietly extracted him afterward, convinced the sabotage had originated inside Blackwood Aeronautics itself, and his death was announced to keep that unnamed insider from ever feeling threatened again. Evelyn admitted she had never known he survived, insisting she was handed only a signed death declaration and told never to ask questions in the name of national security. Sloan could barely contain her anger at learning her own mother had helped bury a near catastrophe involving the company that carried their name. Telling the truth then would have destroyed Blackwood overnight, Evelyn said. Thousands of people would have lost their livelihoods. The justification sounded hollow, even to her, as she spoke it. Rowan told her plainly that the same reasoning had let a saboteur operate freely for 12 uninterrupted years. When they opened the last surviving data fragment from the Aquila 12, the electronic signature buried inside matched the bridging device from Sloan's jet, almost perfectly confirming that whoever built the original weapon had never truly stopped building it. Sloan sat alone with the folders for a long while after the others left the archive, turning the pages slowly, as though the paper itself might explain how an entire chapter of her family's history had been erased so cleanly. She had grown up believing Blackwood was built on careful engineering and her father's stubborn integrity, not on a signature her mother had pressed onto a document meant to bury a man alive. The photographs troubled her most ordinary snapshots of a test crew laughing beside a fueling truck, none of them aware that within days their names would be scrubbed from every internal record the company kept. She thought of the version of herself who had spent years defending Blackwood's history in interviews, repeating the same clean story about innovation and sacrifice without ever asking where the gaps came from. It unsettled her to realize how easily a company could reshape its own past simply by deciding which papers were worth keeping and which were better left to rot in a sealed room. And she wondered for the first time since taking over How many other rooms like this one still existed inside the building she had inherited? Rowan, for his part, stood longer than he meant to in front of the photograph of his younger self, the blacked out name beneath it, a small, tidy erasure of everything he used to be. He remembered the weight of that old flight suit, the particular hum of the Aquila 12's cabin before a test run, and the strange, hollow pride of being trusted with machinery no one else was allowed to touch. None of that pride had prepared him for the years afterward, the shifting apartments, the different last names, the quiet ache of reading his own obituary in a newspaper he was not permitted to correct. He had built a whole new life out of that erasure, measured in oil changes and torque specs, rather than classified briefings, and for years it had been enough simply to exist without anyone asking questions. Standing in the archive, he understood that the version of himself who had accepted disappearance as a fair price for safety was being asked for the first time in over a decade to reconsider what he actually owed the truth. The next morning, Rowan inspected the Vesper X alongside Naomi, and within the hour, he located a diagnostic bridge buried deep in the electronics bay that appeared nowhere in the aircraft's official design documents. Several of Blackwood's engineers made little effort to hide their skepticism, treating him as a small-town mechanic hoping to impress the chief executive. His knowledge belongs to a decade we've already left behind, one senior engineer said openly. Rowan absorbed the remark without argument. Instead of debating credentials, he asked the team to pull the raw system logs, rather than the filtered summaries their software normally produced. The unedited records showed that Vesper X had been quietly receiving unidentified data packets during several recent test flights, always arriving at the exact moment a pilot's attention was most divided during takeoff, during a heading change, during a sudden descent. Silas Bancroft arrived partway through the review greeting, Rowan with practiced warmth while telling the crew to keep the schedule moving. He referred to Rowan only as the temporary contractor, a phrase delivered with a polite smile that Sloan recognized instantly as condescension dressed up as courtesy. A limited test flight went forward with Naomi at the controls, Rowan at the system station, and Sloan riding along because she refused to accept secondhand reports about her own aircraft. At cruising altitude, the navigation display suddenly claimed the plane had drifted off course, though ground radar confirmed their position was correct. Moments later, the autopilot began lowering the nose to fix an altitude that had never actually been wrong. Naomi disengaged the automated system, but the warnings kept contradicting one another faster than the ground crew could read them, and controllers on the radio urged her to simply reboot everything at once. Rowan recognized the pattern immediately. The same trap that had doomed the Aquila 12, an attempt to convince the crew that every instrument had failed so they would try one dangerous, unnecessary maneuver. Hold your course, he told Naomi. Don't shut it all down. Isolate the corrupted channel, only that one. The aircraft leveled out within seconds. Watching him work the cabin with the calm precision of someone who had never truly left the cockpit, Sloan understood that whatever name he carried on his card, now he had been telling only half the truth about the man he used to be. When they landed and reviewed the intercepted transmission, a short automated message sat buried inside the corrupted packet, confirming that someone out there did not merely suspect Rowan had survived. They still possessed his original authorization key from 12 years earlier, and they had just used it to invite him back. Within a day, footage of Rowan seated inside the Vesper X cockpit leaked to several outlets under a headline calling him a mysterious engineer tied to a long-forgotten aviation failure. Silas used the controversy to call an emergency board session, accusing Sloan of allowing an unverified individual into a prototype worth hundreds of millions and endangering the company's most important asset. Directors already nervous about the mounting cost of Vesper X sided quickly with him, and Sloan's authority over the flight test program was suspended before the meeting even adjourned. Silas proposed transferring oversight to a special committee under his own leadership and insisted the public unveiling proceed on schedule to reassure investors watching the stock closely. Rowan understood at once that the saboteur had achieved a first objective, stripping Sloan of control over her own aircraft without touching a single wire. He decided it was time to leave, unwilling to let Maisie's life become collateral in a corporate war that had nothing to do with her. Sloan did not try to physically stop him, but she asked quietly whether the man once called Orion had always walked away when someone needed him most. The question struck a nerve. Orion already lost his whole team, his name, and years of an ordinary life, Rowan answered. He owes Blackwood nothing. Evelyn intercepted him before he reached the exit and confessed she had personally signed the statement blaming pilot error for the Aquila 12 disaster, knowing in her heart that Orion had never made a mistake resembling what the report described. She also revealed something Rowan had never known, that Sloan's late father had quietly investigated a batch of components supplied by a subsidiary connected to Bancroft Capital, an inquiry cut short when illness took his life before he could finish. Rowan pulled up the serial number stamped on the bridging device from Vesper X and traced its registration through a dissolved supplier, following the paper trail until it settled unmistakably on Bancroft Capital's ownership records. He walked back into the boardroom and told Sloan plainly that he was not returning for Blackwood's sake, but because other aircraft out there might still be carrying the same hidden weapon. It was the first real turn of the story. The mechanic the board had dismissed as unqualified, becoming the only person alive who understood exactly what danger sat inside their flagship program. Sloan, Rowan, and Naomi quietly formed a small investigative circle outside official companies' channels, copying every relevant flight record onto an independent server hidden at Greyhaven before anyone could tamper with it. The access logs revealed that the device aboard Vesper X had been activated using Evelyn's personal credentials, and for a tense afternoon, Sloan wondered whether her own mother was protecting someone from 12 years ago without realizing it. Evelyn denied any involvement but could not explain how her private code had been used, and the relationship between mother and daughter grew as strained as it had ever been. Rowan refused to jump to conclusions. Evelyn's credentials, he pointed out, had been logged at the exact moment she was giving a live speech in front of hundreds of witnesses, proof that someone had cloned her old key rather than stolen it in person. That kind of cloning was only possible with material pulled straight from the sealed Asterian archive or salvaged from the wreckage of the Aquila 12 itself. Naomi discovered that Silas privately owned a small aircraft storage facility less than an hour from the testing center, a property once registered as overflow storage for components tied to canceled programs. Rowan and Sloan visited under the pretense of a routine asset inspection, and although Silas had already cleared most of the space, Rowan noticed bolt marks on the concrete that matched the mounting brackets once used for the Aquila 12's backup flight computer. Inside a forgotten storage bin, they found a partially burned memory module, and Rowan recognized the housing instantly as the prototype's emergency data recorder. Sloan wanted to hand the evidence straight to investigators, but Rowan cautioned that the module alone could not yet prove Silas had personally ordered the sabotage, and moving too fast might give him time to destroy whatever remained. When they finally recovered a short fragment of audio from the damaged recorder, a voice from 12 years earlier confirmed that the diagnostic bridge had been installed under direct instructions from what the recording called the Bancroft office. Right behind that fragment played a younger version of Rowan's own voice, calmly ordering his crew to prepare for an emergency landing before the recording cut to static. Silas appeared at the hangar without warning, unbothered by their discovery, and noted evenly that entering private property to remove sealed evidence would make Rowan an ideal suspect if the matter ever reached a courtroom. Corporate security arrived soon after, yet Silas never requested an arrest content, instead to let Rowan walk free so he could keep leading him toward whatever proof still lay out of reach. Driving away that night, Naomi glanced at the burned module spread across the back seat and asked Rowan how he had stayed so calm while a man who clearly wanted him, blamed for a felony, stood a few feet away. Calm is mostly a habit, he admitted. Something I learned in that cockpit and never quite managed to set down. Panic is the one tool Silas actually needs. A frightened engineer makes the mistakes a patient one never will. Sloan spent the drive tracing Bancroft Capital's fingerprints through 3 different shell entities before the trail went cold at a registered agent's office in a state she had never once visited for company business. She noticed how carefully the paperwork had been layered, each entity just distant enough from the last to survive a routine audit, and it struck her that a disguise this elaborate required years of patient preparation. Whoever assembled it had been planning long before Vesper X ever existed, waiting only for a project large enough to justify the risk. Back at Greyhaven, Rowan spent most of the night carefully drying the salvaged module, using equipment better suited to a data recovery lab than a regional airfield's back office, refusing to let anyone touch it until he was sure the fragile circuitry would survive. Naomi stayed with him long after Sloan had gone to check on her mother, passing him tools without being asked. And somewhere around midnight, she finally said what she'd been thinking since the test flight, that whoever trained him all those years ago had trained him well enough to still catch things. Engineers twice his age missed entirely. Rowan only nodded and kept working, unwilling to talk about a man he had spent 12 years trying not to think about. Later, he laid out the rest of what happened after the Aquila 12's forced landing. Evidence recovered afterward strongly suggested the sabotage had come from inside Blackwood, but before he could bring it forward, the fire consumed the electronics bay and destroyed nearly everything that might have proven it. A counterintelligence team, suspicious that even the rescue crew had been compromised, quietly relocated him under a new identity. The investigation dragged on for years against constant unexplained obstruction from within the very system meant to support it. Evidence vanishing from secure servers, witnesses reassigned overseas before they could be interviewed. Budget reviews that always seemed to shrink the moment the inquiry edged toward a name with real influence attached. Rowan spent those years repeating the same account to investigators who rotated out every 18 months, telling it to unfamiliar faces until even he began to wonder whether anyone above a certain rank actually wanted the truth found. Once the trail went cold, he chose to stop chasing ghosts and live quietly as Rowan Hale. When his wife passed from illness not long after he raised Maisie alone rather than risk pulling her into a world defined by secrecy and danger, he had turned down every offer to return to experimental aviation, refusing to let his daughter grow up beside a father forever hunting his own past, choosing instead the unglamorous rhythm of torque wrenches and maintenance logs, a life small enough that no one ever thought to look for Orion inside it. Sloan finally understood that Rowan had not disappeared out of cowardice. He had surrendered his reputation entirely to give his daughter something resembling an ordinary childhood. The next recovered fragment confirmed that Sloan's father had never been involved in the sabotage at all. He had instead discovered that Bancroft Capital was quietly selling diagnostic systems built with hidden backdoor access to multiple aviation companies at once. Silas had originally sabotaged the Aquila 12 to derail its unveiling and forced Blackwood into financial dependence on Bancroft's investment fund. The accident spiraled far past his plan, but rather than stop, he used his influence to bury the entire investigation before it reached the public. 12 years later, he was running the same play against Vesper X, having already shorted Blackwood stock and arranged a rescue financing deal that would let Bancroft Capital seize the company's patents the moment it collapsed. He never intended to crash an aircraft in front of cameras, only to manufacture a chain of alarms terrifying enough to force an emergency landing and freeze the test program indefinitely. Rowan's return had complicated all of it, and Silas answered by using the cloned Orion credentials, both to taunt him and to frame him as the most convenient suspect available. Alone in his office that evening, Silas allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Certain a mechanic from a regional airfield posed no real threat to a plan he had refined for over a decade across 3 separate companies. He had watched Blackwood claw back from the brink once and had learned exactly which levers brought it to the edge again patiently, buying influence funding, friendly directors waiting for the moment the company's ambition would outpace its caution. Vesper X was the largest bet Blackwood had ever made, and that made it to him the perfect instrument for finishing what the Aquila 12 had only begun. He did not think of himself as a saboteur so much as a corrector of overconfident institutions forced to use unconventional tools because the slower legitimate ones had never once worked in his favor. What unsettled him now was not conscience, but uncertainty. A small, persistent doubt about how a man he believed erased from every record could still walk into a hangar and recognize his own handiwork within minutes. He told himself the world had been convinced of Orion's death for over a decade, and reputations built on that kind of public certainty rarely survive one mechanic's uncorroborated claims. He underestimated, as he always had, the particular danger of a man with nothing left to protect except the truth and a daughter waiting for him to come home. Rowan built his plan around turning the unveiling flight into a trap of his own design. He deliberately left the hidden bridge installed inside Vesper X, reasoning that removing it would immediately warn Silas his scheme had been discovered. Instead, he wired a passive recording channel to capture every remote command sent through the device without triggering any alert on the sender's end. Naomi would fly. Rowan would monitor the systems from the engineering seat. Sloan would ride along as the company's own representative, determined to prove her confidence in the product with her presence rather than a press release. Before boarding, Rowan called Maisie one final time, and she asked when he'd be home so they could finish rebuilding an old model airplane together, exactly as they'd planned for weeks. "One last piece of work," he told her, "and then I'm done." Maisie did not ask her father to be a hero. She simply told him to make sure he came back, a request so plain it settled something inside him that years of investigation never had. The call reminded him that his goal was never to resurrect the legend, only to close a chapter so he could keep living the one he'd built afterward as himself. Sloan overheard part of it and promised that whatever happened, she would never let Blackwood use him as a tool again. A quiet trust had grown between them, patient and unhurried. Sloan no longer saw a legend hidden behind a mechanic's coveralls. She saw a man who wanted to go home to his daughter, and that mattered to her more than any code name. She told him almost hesitantly that she had spent her whole adult life being introduced as the heir to something enormous, a company, a fortune, an expectation she had never been allowed to question, and that watching him choose an ordinary life over a legendary one had quietly rearranged how she thought about her own. Rowan admitted that ordinary had not always felt like a choice so much as a sentence he'd learned to accept, but that somewhere in the years of watching Maisie grow, the sentence had become closer to a gift. Neither of them tried to name what was forming between them. Evelyn used her authority as a founding shareholder to have the entire unveiling flight streamed live into the boardroom, and Silas, believing it would only strengthen the presentation, raised no objection. Rowan quietly built a false interface designed to convince the operations center that the bridging device remained under their complete control, while every genuine command sent through it would be captured and isolated before it ever reached the aircraft. Just before the cabin door closed, Silas approached Rowan, shook his hand, and leaned in to murmur a warning meant only for the two of them. Rowan answered calmly that Silas was right about one thing, because Orion would not be flying that morning at all. Only Rowan Hale, a man with nothing left to hide and nothing left to prove. Vesper X lifted off under the watchful eyes of the board, a room full of investors and officials from Federal Aviation Oversight, every screen tuned to the unveiling. The early portion of the flight went exactly as planned, and Silas grew confident Rowan had failed to detect the full scope of what he had built into the system. As the aircraft prepared for its automated demonstration sequence, the operations center transmitted a command using the cloned Orion key, instantly triggering false readings for speed, altitude, and engine temperature all at once. Naomi kept her composure exactly as Rowan had instructed, ignoring the cascade of contradictory alarms and verifying the aircraft's true condition through independent mechanical instruments the corrupted software could not touch. Silas escalated with a stronger command ordering the autopilot to drop the nose and divert toward a backup airfield, hoping to create the appearance of Vesper X spiraling out of control in front of hundreds of witnesses. Rowan activated the isolation channel he'd built the night before, and the aircraft ignored the command entirely while quietly logging the originating address, the authorization key, and the exact timestamp of the attempted intrusion. Sloan ordered the captured data thrown directly onto the boardroom screens, and in front of the entire assembled board, the sabotage commands traced back unmistakably to Silas Bancroft's personal workstation. A murmur spread through the room as directors who had sided with him only days earlier began shifting their chairs away from his end of the table, none of them willing to be photographed near a man whose name had just appeared beside a felony in progress. Silas insisted his system had been compromised by an outside party, but Rowan followed immediately with the recovered audio from the Aquila 12 and the ownership records tying the original bridging device to Bancroft Capital. One of the oldest directors, a woman who had sat on Blackwood's board since his earliest years, asked Silas directly whether he intended to explain the 12-year gap between two identical sabotage patterns or simply keep denying evidence the whole room had just watched with its own eyes. Silas tried to redirect toward Rowan's own unverified identity, suggesting a man who had hidden behind a false name for over a decade made a poor witness against anyone. I spent 12 years hiding from the very device Silas just tried to use against an aircraft full of people, Rowan answered. I see no reason to keep hiding from it now. Evelyn stood before the room and publicly admitted she had once helped conceal the earlier disaster, accepting full responsibility for her role without hesitation, and her confession stripped away the last shield Silas had. In one final act of desperation, he transmitted a false warning, claiming the landing gear had failed to deploy, but Rowan confirmed through mechanical sensors that the gear remained fully operational, and Naomi completed a careful visual pass before bringing Vesper X down safely on the runway. There was no crash, no violence, no dramatic confrontation on the tarmac, only a man undone by the very data he'd believed belonged to him alone. Federal agents were waiting when the aircraft rolled to a stop and Silas was taken into custody on charges tied to aviation sabotage, market manipulation, and the destruction of evidence spanning more than a decade. Sloan stepped off in front of the cameras, turned back toward Rowan, and refused to introduce him, using the name that had haunted him for 12 years. Instead, she simply called him Rowan Hale, the man who had just saved the future of Blackwood Aeronautics, with nothing but steady hands and an unwillingness to look away. The wider investigation eventually proved that Silas had directed several shell companies to plant identical bridging devices across other aviation programs unrelated to Blackwood, and every unit was recovered before it could cause harm. The board reinstated Sloan as chief executive and terminated every financial arrangement tied to Bancroft Capital, closing the door on 12 years of quiet manipulation in a single afternoon. Vesper X underwent a full independent review before its certification resumed, this time under oversight no single company could quietly control. Evelyn held a public briefing acknowledging that Blackwood had once blamed the Aquila 12 crew for a disaster the family had long known was never their fault, formally clearing the names of every engineer who had vanished from the record that day. She met Rowan privately at Greyhaven soon afterward and apologized for placing the survival of the company above the dignity of the people who had built it. Rowan did not forgive her instantly, but he acknowledged that she had in the end chosen honesty, even knowing it would cost her family's carefully guarded reputation. Sloan offered Rowan the position of chief technical officer, and he declined, unwilling to trade his daughter's ordinary life for another existence built around boardrooms, security details, and aircraft carrying secrets of their own. Instead, he proposed something different, an independent aviation safety division named the Orion Protocol, dedicated to finding the kinds of hidden vulnerabilities that could trick a pilot into trusting the wrong instrument at the wrong moment. The division would be based permanently at Greyhaven, so he could keep raising Maisie without uprooting either of their lives. Blackwood would fund the work, but hold no authority to alter or bury a single report it produced, and Sloan accepted every condition without argument. In the weeks that followed, Naomi transferred out of Blackwood's primary test program to help build the new division from nothing. Arguing that after everything they had survived together, she was not about to let him assemble a safety team without a pilot who actually trusted his instincts. Evelyn quietly funded a scholarship in the names of the original Asterian crew, ensuring that the engineers erased from Blackwood's history would finally be remembered somewhere permanent, even if the world never learned the full story behind their disappearance. Sloan visited Greyhaven often enough that the ground crew stopped remarking on it, arriving sometimes with contracts to review and sometimes with nothing more than an excuse to watch Rowan work. Maisie grew used to seeing Sloan's car parked beside the hangar in the evenings, and though she never asked her father outright what the two of them were becoming, She noticed the particular ease that had settled into their conversations, the kind that only grows between two people who have already survived the worst version of getting to know each other. Rowan found himself thinking less about the man he used to be and more about ordinary things, whether Maisie's model airplane needed a second coat of paint, whether Sloane took her coffee before or after it went cold, whether Greyhaven's runway lights needed replacing before winter. The Orion Protocol issued its first public safety bulletin within 2 months, quietly forcing three unrelated manufacturers to recall diagnostic hardware built on the same vulnerable architecture Silas had once exploited. None of the reports carried Rowan's real name, only the division's exactly the way he wanted it, a legacy built on prevention rather than recognition. Evelyn visited Greyhaven one final time before stepping back from the board, entirely walking the length of the small hangar with a slower gait than the one that had once commanded whole rooms. She told Rowan that watching him build something quiet and lasting out of the wreckage of Asterion had taught her more about leadership than 3 decades at Blackwood ever had. He walked her back to her car without answering, but he shook her hand before she left, a small gesture that closed a distance 12 years of silence had never quite managed to bridge on his own. At the end, Maisie arrived at the hangar after school and noticed a small 7-point constellation painted near the wing of an old test aircraft and asked her father why everyone once called him by the name of a star pattern. It used to belong to a man who believed he had to carry the whole sky by himself, Rowan told her. Maisie asked whether that man was gone now. Rowan looked toward Sloane, who stood just outside the hangar doors, holding 2 cups of coffee and watching them both with a quiet, unhurried patience. He smiled and told his daughter that the man had simply learned he no longer had to carry it alone. Sloane handed Rowan his coffee and asked if she could stay and watch the two of them finish rebuilding the model airplane. He answered by pulling the hangar door open wider, an invitation that needed no further words. The constellation on the old fuselage caught the afternoon light one last time, but Rowan no longer flinched at the name painted beneath it. Orion had finally been cleared. Rowan Hale had finally been allowed to live. If you love aviation secrets and a twist that catches your breath, hit subscribe, leave a comment telling me the moment you first suspected Silas, and follow along because there's another story coming. And somewhere out there, another buried truth is still waiting to be found.